I'm Charles Uphaus. I'm working with the Office of Agriculture at USAID on assisting them to rebuild the agricultural capacity of the agency that has been so diminished over the recent years. With the new administration initiative on global food security, there is an imperative to rebuild the agricultural staff at USAID, and that is my role at present, is to help with the recruiting and the mentoring and the training and the rebuilding of that staff capability. The 2010 Hunger Report is focused on what's involved in getting sustainable recovery from the current economic crisis. And my own work has been looking at this in the international context to demonstrate how sustainable recovery in the U.S. is going to be affected by, and in turn affects, sustainable recovery in the rest of the world, particularly in the developing world. And then to link this to the whole issue of climate change, which is going to profoundly affect both recovery in the U.S. and globally. Poor people are the ones who are going to get hammered by climate change. If you look at the example of Hurricane Katrina in this country, who suffered the worst of the damage? It was the poor people in New Orleans and the surrounding area. The same is true globally. We already have climate change underway. It's documented. You have increasing incidence of storms. You have melting glaciers with greater variation in stream flows. You have more variable rainfall. And it's the poor people who lack resources, who lack the financial resources, the institutional resources that we have in rich countries, who are going to get hammered by these kinds of changes in climate. And it's going to be most profound in agriculture, which is where you find most of the poverty in the developing world. If we look at Africa or South Asia, the vast majority of the poor people are either farmers or are in the rural sector and dependent on agriculture in one way or the other. So that if we're serious about addressing hunger and poverty around the world, we need to look at agriculture, and specifically how agriculture is being affected by climate change. A fundamental issue that we have to deal with in thinking about recovery and climate change is the fact that poor countries are being profoundly affected by climate change, and this is something that they are not responsible for. Since 1900, perhaps 10% of the total greenhouse gas emissions have come from poor countries. The rest has come from the rich countries, who got rich by using a lot of energy based on fossil fuels, which contributed to the global warming problem. Some people have likened poor countries to drive-by victims in this global arena. They are not responsible, but they're bearing the cost of this. This is both not right. There's a fundamental issue of justice here, but there's also the issue of, as I started out by saying, we're all in this together, and we're not going to have sustainable recovery in this country as long as there's continued poverty overseas and vice versa. 2010 Hunger Report lays out issues and recommendations for the upcoming Conference of Parties in Copenhagen in December. This is a very important global conference that's coming up that will have to deal with issues such as imposing limits on greenhouse gas emissions, but we also are looking for Copenhagen to deal with questions of financing for adaptation for poor countries, for how we deal with agriculture in the context of global climate change, how we arrange to make sure that poor countries are not constrained in their development by the need to put limits on the emission of greenhouse gases. We also need to make sure, coming out of Copenhagen, that we don't constrain or limit the development of poor countries. Development is very energy intensive, and so poor countries are going to have to use more energy. The question is whether that's going to be greenhouse gas emitting, carbon intensive energy, or it's going to be modern solar and wind and other kinds of technologies. So Copenhagen also has to help make that transition onto a lower carbon growth path. I'd say the number one thing wrong with the way people do development these days is they do it without really understanding the context in which they're working. What are the issues being confronted by developing countries? What are their priorities? We tend to go into this with kind of a paternalistic, I would say, attitude that we really know what's best for the developing world, when in fact it may not be. And this in turn influences what we do and how we do it. I think we need to turn this development model on its head and start by figuring out what the developing world wants, what its issues and priorities are, and then figuring out, okay, how can we help them meet their expressed needs and priorities.